Wow, was that an amazing weekend of racing or what? The action has been non-stop, starting with the sprint race at the Catalonian MotoGP. Raul Fernandez looked like he was going to be leading much of the sprint after an awesome overtaking of Acosta, but then moments later he crashed out from the lead. How impressive has the rookie Pedro Acosta been this year? Every race he seems to be just in the thick of it. And then almost as soon as Brad Bender overtook the lead from Acosta, he too crashed out from the lead. So Pedro Acosta definitely had his hands full trying to fight for a final podium spot with Marc Marquez. Meanwhile, over at the front of the pack, Pecco was battling Alexis Espargaro and the Aprilia for the lead on the final lap. Then when Pecco finally passed him, he promptly crashed out of the lead. So if you keep in count, that's 3 riders who crashed out from the lead. And this was only the MotoGP sprint. Meanwhile, over in Formula 1, Charles Leclerc qualified for pole position at the Monaco Grand Prix for the 3rd time in his career. Born and raised in Monaco, Leclerc grew up watching Formula 1 cars race around the streets where he grew up. The notoriously narrow street circuit is incredibly difficult to pass on, so the actual race ends up being somewhat of a procession of a bunch of parade laps, meaning the pole sitter usually ends up winning the race. Not so for Leclerc and Ferrari. They seem to have a knack for messing things up even from the pole position. The Ferrari had been quick all weekend long with fastest laps in P1 and in P2. Surprisingly, Max Verstappen could only manage a 6th place finish in qualifying, and that ruined his successive pole position streak at 8 races in a row. Alright, jumping back to Sunday, over at MotoGP, Pecco Bagnaia would not allow his DNF from the sprint rate to impact the full MotoGP, and on race day, Pecco would battle Jorge Martin and Acosta at the front of the pack for the race lead. But this time, it was Pedro Acosta who would crash out from 2nd place, and that allowed Pecco and Martin to battle head-to-head for the remainder of the race. Pecco and the factory Ducati team managed to hold off Martin to win the Catalonian Grand Prix, and Marc Marquez continued his strong season with yet another podium finish. The excitement continued in Monaco, and the Formula Grand Prix did not disappoint. Leclerc got off to a great start to hold P1, and then Carlos Sainz and the other Ferrari slotted into 3rd, but then went wide in one of the early corners before the completion of the first lap. Luckily, he was saved from a disastrous race result by a massive crash, which took out the Red Bull of Sergio Perez and red flagged the race before a lap had even been completed. When the restart grid was released, Carlos was back in P3. At the restart, Leclerc got off to another great launch to keep P1, and the rest of the race was fairly uneventful, with Charles Leclerc finishing 1st, followed by Oscar Piastri's McLaren, and Carlos Sainz in the 2nd Ferrari finished 3rd. Leclerc is the first Monegasque to win the home F1 since the World Championship began in 1950, and Prince Albert, who's usually long gone when the champagne starts flowing, stayed to celebrate with Leclerc and Ferrari. Switching over to the Indy 500, after a 4-hour rain delay, another first lap crash was just the start of multiple crashes and engine failures. I sometimes think that the Indy 500 really is a race of survival. That weather delay, however, put Carl Larson's attempt at the double at risk. So the Memorial Day weekend double, which is 1,100 miles, combines the Indy 500 and the Coca-Cola 600. Talk about an iron butt challenge. Only 4 drivers have previously attempted one of the most grueling days in all of motorsports, and the timing has to be almost perfect to really pull it off. The final lap at Indy had plenty of excitement and disappointment. Pato O'Ward was doing his best to try and hold off the 2020 Indy 500 winner Joseph Newgarden, but in the end, the Aero McLaren car finished 2nd to match the McLaren's result earlier in the day over at Monaco. Newgarden and Team Penske were able to drink the milk and become the first back-to-back winner of the Indy 500 since Helio Castroneves did it way back in 2002. Kyle Larson had a pit penalty and eventually finished in 18th, and arrived in Charlotte just in time for a weather delay there, which would have allowed him to relieve his backup driver and allow Larson to race the remainder of the Coca-Cola 600. However, the weather delay turned into a red flag race, and NASCAR ended the race after 251 laps of the scheduled 400 laps, and Larson was never able to get out on track. So that was definitely a disappointing way to end what had been a super exciting weekend. Alright, well that wraps up my recap of the most exciting weekend in all of motorsports. I'll try and pick another weekend with the multiple races and do another recap then. But in the meantime, put down in the comments which races you watched this weekend and which were the most exciting moments for you.
If you're enjoying these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and to the newsletter using the links below. We'll share more tool buying tips, classic car and classic motorcycle project finds, some motorsport news, and maybe a wrenching tip or two.